Kia ora everyone. Kia ora koutou. Ko Graham Acton aho. I'm Graham Acton, the manager of the Asia Media Centre at the Foundation. We are tasked with helping the New Zealand media cover Asia, predominantly via a journalism grants program, but we're also involved in intern journalism in Asia, as well as running our own news and features website and assisting media here in accessing experts across the region. And media coverage of Asia in this country is, apart from our funding contributions, usually a foreign wires story in print, on the web or on radio and TV. New Zealand currently has no foreign correspondents in Asia, and so we sometimes can have difficulty perceiving the region properly through a Kiwi lens. Asia coverage is often disaster coverage, conflict coverage and environmental issues. All those things are important, of course, but what's missing often is the nuance. To discuss media coverage of the region, we're joined today by three esteemed journalists, Jean Lee, Anna Fifield and Sam Sachdeva. Anna Fifield, to my immediate left, is the Asia Pacific editor for The Washington Post and a former bureau chief for the Post in Tokyo and Beijing. She's also former editor of The Dominion Post and author of The Great Successor, an extraordinary book on the life of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Jean Lee is a journalist and foreign policy analyst renowned for her expertise in covering North Korea and Northeast Asian affairs. She is co-host of the award-winning Lazarus Heist podcast for the BBC World Service and a former Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press, the first and only US news bureau to open in North Korea. She's currently an adjunct fellow at the East-West Centre in Hawaii and also at the European Centre for North Korean Studies at the University of Vienna. And down the end there, Sam Sachdeva is Newsroom's National Affairs Editor and one of the few journalists in New Zealand now covering foreign affairs. He's the author of The China Tightrope, Navigating New Zealand's Relationship with a World Superpower, and a great friend of the Foundation. I'd like you to help me welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Kia ora, Graham, and kia ora tātou katoa. It's my pleasure to be here today for this panel, one of my favourite subjects, New Zealand media coverage of Asia, with two esteemed journalists, Jean, who I've known for maybe 15 years, a very long time, and Sam, who I have to confess I did ask while I was at Stuff if we had funding to clone Sam. Unfortunately, the answer to that was no, so we still only have one Sam. But today we will talk about some of the challenges facing New Zealand media coverage of Asia and about Asia and issues here in New Zealand. I've got some questions, but I think it'll be fun as well to open it up. So if you have questions as well, I'll make sure to leave plenty of time. We've got mics so that you can ask questions too. As Graham said, in New Zealand we no longer have any foreign correspondents in Asia. TVNZ obviously has correspondents in the UK, a very 20th century model. I would say the Royals and rugby round over there, but we have nobody covering the issues that are right in our backyard, that are most important to us. China is obviously our biggest economic partner and our biggest security challenge too. And when we do get coverage of these areas, they tend to be, as Graham said, from wires written for American audiences or British audiences, or not with a New Zealand lens or a New Zealand interest on them. So that's a pretty sad state of affairs. But thank goodness we have Sam, who is doing a terrific job covering foreign policy in New Zealand. And we also have the two Thomases, Thomas Coughlin and Thomas Manch, and also maybe some other people not called Thomas, writing about foreign policy in New Zealand. So I thought it'd be great to ask Sam about how he approaches the task of covering these issues, and also to ask Jean to comment on how some of the changing landscape in the US has influenced coverage of Asia there. Sam, I know from my time at the Dominion Post, when I was commissioning stories about China and about New Zealand's interests in China, there was a lot of interest in it. These stories performed really well online. The audience is definitely interested in this coverage, but there's obviously relatively little of it in our media here in New Zealand today. You are one of the few journalists writing about New Zealand's foreign policy. Can you maybe start us off by telling us, you obviously also write about a lot of other national issues. How much of your week do you spend writing about foreign policy, and what are the considerations that you take into account when thinking about how to cover issues in Asia for a New Zealand audience?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I would say at the moment it's maybe a 60-40 split between, foreign affairs reporting, so that's not just on Asia, but foreign policy and other national issues. And when I first started at Newsroom in 2017, it was as a foreign affairs and trade editor, so I think I was fortunate that I landed at an outlet that valued that area of reporting specifically and felt that it was undercovered and needed some more coverage here. And that has maintained through, but you do also feel a little bit of pressure, because I think you're right that stories about China can rate well. Other stories about Asia, not always, and it does tend to ebb and flow, I think. So you've always got in the back of your mind, look, am I doing enough? Am I writing the stories that are of interest to our audience? I am fortunate at Newsroom, as I say, we've got an interest in this, the editors do, but also we are a more niche publication by design. We're not trying to compete with Stuff or the New Zealand Herald or Radio New Zealand in terms of audience numbers, so I get a little bit more latitude to write about things like ASEAN or India, but it is a balance, so you have that pressure in the back of your mind, you know, am I getting a little bit too far into the weeds here, or is there enough of an audience for this?
Mm. Are any of your experiences at Newsroom, you think, replicable, or are there lessons that can be learned by other New Zealand media? Like, are there things that could be done, do you think, across the New Zealand media landscape to increase reporting on and about Asia and foreign policy issues?
Great question. I'm not sure. I think it's difficult. It's probably just having newsroom editors, the right people in place who value the work and will, you know, give reporters the time to report on that. And I know you did that at the Dominion Post. I think when we saw an uplift in the amount of Asia coverage in the paper, but a lot of it is led by individuals. So I don't know how you put systemic change in. It's just having the right people, I think, who will back you to do that work.
I think, a big part of it is that having foreign correspondents in particular is extremely expensive, but doing the kind of in-depth reporting that you do as well and things that takes a long time. So I think that in New Zealand, the economics of it are so much harder than they are for foreign papers because we are so small, right? So Jean, you and I used to cover North Korea, like, mostly from the outside, sometimes from the inside, and that was a very tricky thing to do. Obviously, things have changed a lot with North Korea, and nobody's getting in at all anymore. But increasingly, that's also the case with China. So many correspondents, like, there are no New Zealand correspondents in China, but amongst the foreign correspondents, the American correspondents in China, almost everybody, or many people have been expelled, and the ones who've remained find it extremely difficult to do the kind of reporting on the ground that we like to read. So I was interested in asking you, what is the importance of having reporters on the ground in places? How does that contribute to our understanding of some of these places, and how is it harder to be reporting on the outside?
Yeah, first of all, how is it that we're only now speaking together on a panel? Our careers have overlapped so much, but we've never actually reported in the same place at the same time. But I just want to thank the Asia New Zealand Foundation for bringing us together, and I'm honored to be here with the legendary Sam as well. And you're undercutting your role. So when I first got to Seoul, Anna was the legend because she was really the only journalist.
Let's get to the answer.
Spent time on the ground in North Korea. So in the competitive spirit, I knew I had to get on the ground as well. So I do think that one of the concerns I see with coverage of China is that increasingly, especially when it comes to this heightened U.S.-China strategic competition, that access for journalists is becoming somewhat of a political tool. And we're seeing more and more journalists excluded from China. Their visas are not being renewed. And I want to say that, because you had, in our email exchange, you had mentioned the coverage of China. I think that so far, the coverage, and I have to be careful because you are the Asia editor of the Washington Post, I want to say that so far there has been enough of a legacy of foreign correspondence in China that the coverage is still really good. But I am seeing more and more that the coverage is becoming reactive. And I think that China had a reason, particularly around 2008 with the Beijing Olympics, to allow foreign correspondents in, to make it seem like they were like another major power, allowing journalists into the country. But since then, we've seen that welcome retreat. And in a sense, it is very tiresome to have American journalists in particular, in any country, I say that as an American. And so they've wanted to shut American journalists out, foreign journalists out, and take control of the narrative. And so when I say the news tends to be reactive, we are sometimes waiting for developments that are sometimes instigated by China and North Korea themselves. This is more so the case, of course, with North Korea. And so I do see with China and North Korea coverage that it's responsive. Now, what's missing, and I think that journalists have been very resourceful in finding ways to cover these countries, even if you can't get on the ground. With North Korea, that means using satellite imagery to really look from above to see what we can spot. But what you miss then is the human element. And one of our responsibilities as journalists is not only to report the news developments and to provide analysis, but also, I think, to provide that human element and to find a way to use storytelling to connect them to us and to give our audiences, our readers, our viewers, an understanding of why we should care. And so in some sense, when we're not on the ground and we don't have those really personal stories, if we're just writing off of state media or interviews with officials from the outside, we miss that color and that nuance, and we miss everything that makes a place less black and white, all the complications that make a place real to us. And of course, North Korea is one of those places. I think that, and I'm just going to switch to North Korea for a second because that's my area of expertise. North Korea has retreated into isolation very strategically. As you mentioned, we have not seen any foreign correspondents in North Korea for more than 5 years. It's been since 2019. You and I are probably among the last journalists to be on the ground in North Korea. And that isolation means in some ways that they're able to wrest back control of the narrative and so that we respond when they want us to respond. The danger in that is that North Korea is a very dangerous country to ignore. If it's out of sight and out of mind, that means that they give themselves space to build a weapons program that does have the danger of threatening all of us. And so one of the things I did in 2020 when no one was paying attention to North Korea because they had retreated so much into isolation, it concerned me. Because I thought if we don't pay attention, we don't find a way to convince our audiences that they need to pay attention, what is at stake? And what we know now, of course, is that they were quietly and very aggressively building their weapons program in isolation and funding it despite the border closures, despite sanctions, through cyber theft. And so I wanted to try to find a way to bring attention back to North Korea, but not only draw attention to it, but make sure that everyone in every part of the world had a reason to see that they were somehow connected to that threat. And so that is the challenge for us, I think, as journalists as well, is how do you, in an age of information onslaught, make sure that people are sitting up and paying attention and feel connected at a time when we don't have access. So what I did with the podcast was make sure to mention as many countries as I could, their connection to North Korea, and use really personal stories so that people sat up and felt a connection. And I have to say that season 2 starts with a New Zealander, starts with a Kiwi. So every country is somehow connected, just to get you interested. But start with season 1, episode 1.
Great plug there. On your point on China, I think you're exactly spot on there. I mean, I run a team that covers China. None of them are in China. Everybody was, during 2020, as a tit-for-tat political response during the Trump administration, expelled, and we haven't been able to get visas for people to go back in. The same, the New York Times used to have 12 people in, I think they have 2 now. And the people who are there have much, much more difficulty interviewing people. There is now a real climate of fear. Everyday people don't want to talk to foreign correspondents who are probably spies, according to what they are told there, and that has a real impact. But I think, to your point, Jean, it means that the coverage of China in particular now is now so hard. It is written from the outside, it's South China Sea, it's military build-up, it's aggression, all of which are absolutely very important stories and are true and need to be told. But we don't have the other side of the story. We don't have the stories about our shared humanity, the texture of human life and the things that we have in common. So that is the thing, like not the Washington Post just, but that's very hard to do from the outside. But across the board, I think there's been this real decrease in the human stories coming out of China and the things that bind us together, which has really fed into this kind of political climate in the United States where there is a tendency, there's a lot of political hostility towards China. So it feels quite tangible in terms of the effect on coverage in the international media of what's happening inside China. Sam, I wondered if I could turn back to you and ask, from your perspective, what do you think we as New Zealand lose by not having New Zealand journalists? There aren't even New Zealand freelancers. China doesn't recognise the concept of a freelancer inside China, reporting on issues that matter directly to us, whether they are trade-related in terms of Zespri and Sichuan or what have you, like all of the issues that could be of interest and importance to a New Zealand audience. What do we miss by not having correspondents in the region?
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount. I think it's like you and Jean said, it's that human context and human colour. And if you think of the nature of media travel to Asia, not just to China, how do New Zealand journalists get there? There are 3 main mechanisms. One is media grants, like from the Asia New Zealand Foundation, which I think they do a great job, and that is very valuable. The second is on a Prime Minister's trip, which is fine, but you're sort of rushing through places in motorcades and going from banquet hall to banquet hall, and it's not a very human or realistic experience. And the third is through, a trip that is sponsored by a foreign government, and that presents its own risks. And I have been on a few of those, and I'm very aware of the perceptions of not bias, but perhaps something akin to that. That as soon as you have another government picking up the tab, it's has to be disclosed, and it is. But I can understand why people might be sceptical about that. And in an ideal world, that wouldn't happen, and media outlets would be funding their own trips or having correspondents there. But I think the reality of the media landscape is budgets are being cut; they're not being increased, and I don't think there's going to be any resource going into that area in the near future, sadly.
Sadly, I think you're right on that as well. It is feels like a loss. Jean, I wanted to ask you about the political climate in the United States. We are now in a situation where the political hostility towards China is now so bipartisan. There's nobody who would ever kind of stand up and advocate for closer relations with China. Now we have a vice presidential candidate who is being roundly criticised for once promoting people-to-people exchanges with ordinary Chinese people. So I wanted to ask you, has that had an impact, do you think, as a consumer of news, on the kind of coverage you see in the United States of China?
That's a good point. I was going to mention the fact that there's, the political climate is extremely polarized in the United States, except when it comes to China. And I always worry that there's potential for an increase in xenophobia. And as an Asian American, I also worry about the impact that has on someone like me, who is often mistaken for a foreigner in my own country. And I can certainly feel, for example, in the early years of the Trump administration, when we first had the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of anti-Chinese language, a lot of blame for the COVID pandemic on China. the Kung flu, and I shouldn't even repeat these because they're so painful for me, and that directly translated into anti-Asian hate crimes. So I always worry, I think, as a journalist, as an analyst, as somebody who's interested in foreign policy, the responsibility that we bear to make sure that we are finding the right balance between covering the tension and the real threat that comes from some of the activities carried out by the CCP, while also making sure that we're not veering into sort of blanket xenophobia, and to make sure that we're, from a policy perspective, projecting the need to find a way to live and work with China. So I do kind of straddle two worlds, the world of journalism and the world of foreign policy. And when I am engaging with counterparts from China, we always try to emphasize that even though I'm American, or my counterparts are American, that we look for those areas of commonality. And North Korea does sometimes happen to be one of those. So, climate change, the environment, North Korea, areas where you can find some areas of commonality. But in terms of coverage, yes, I do worry in terms of the political environment. I do worry that there's a fine line between making sure and alerting the public about the threat and trying to avoid sort of blanket xenophobia that can have consequences on the political environment in the U.S. I actually found it very interesting that Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz, who's from my home state of Minnesota, so I'm not biased, because he did have a background in China and is an example of somebody who can show that you can be tough on China while still advocating for people-to-people contact. And I think for those of us who have spent time in these countries, China, North Korea, you also recognize that you don't necessarily have to have that kind of a black and white policy, that you can criticize a government while still trying to advocate for the people, which is, I think, what Governor Walz does. And so I think he shows it is very controversial, but I think he shows the sophistication and the importance of having that type of a nuanced approach. And I think that this was discussed earlier. We often hear in South Korea, for example, I had a lot of discussions with South Koreans who said, don't make us choose between the United States and China. And this echoes what we've heard earlier. They've lived with China for thousands of years, and they know that their future is tied to a relationship with China. And so it's something that I try to convey in the United States as well.
Yeah. Sam, I wondered, obviously we're in a very different political environment in New Zealand, but I'm wondering how does the change of government and the change of tenor, the change of minister even, have an impact on the kind of discussion or the talking points that you are getting from the government on any of these issues? Does it feel like it influences how much you write, what you write about? Like, is there a political, does the changing political environment have any impact on the coverage of Asia and New Zealand, do you think?
Yes, and I think there are specific topics like AUKUS, obviously, and some of the rhetoric, the language from the government, the coalition government around that in particular, and which obviously relates to China, maybe is primarily about China, depending on who you talk to, that has created a lot of interest and concern from some people in New Zealand. So I think there's more reader interest in that and capacity to cover that. On the trade front, you've got the Prime Minister who's given this very highly ambitious goal of a FTA with India within this term. Whether or not that happens, we'll have to wait and see. So I think that's put more of a spotlight on India, and that's probably worthwhile, because I think that has been a little bit undercovered probably in the media, as well as from recent governments. And we've seen again Prime Minister Luxon travel throughout Southeast Asia, and he's got this sort of big trade agenda. So again, I talked about prime ministerial trips and how it's sort of a very narrow view of the world, but at the same time it's probably getting more journalists there than perhaps would be going in the past. So I think the sort of idea of an active international agenda, yes, that's partly messaging from the government, but it is probably flowing through in terms of the coverage of the region from New Zealand media.
Yeah, you hit on one of my other pet peeves here, in that I remember asking somebody in this government now, before they came in, what their foreign policy priorities were, and they said FTA with India, FTA with UAE, and FTA with someone else. And I was like, no, foreign policy. Didn't go down very well. Anyway, on that note, who has questions from the audience? If people have questions, there's a roving microphone somewhere. I think it will find its way to you. We have a gentleman in the third row. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam and Jean. Same question, first for Sam and then for Jean. The question is, Sam, can you please share with us your perception of how the media sees Indians in New Zealand? Question 1A. And 1B, how New Zealand perceives India. And then we go on to Jean.
Oh, that is a big question. I think... Sorry, the question was about how the media perceives Indians in New Zealand and then how New Zealand perceives India. I think there is a broadly positive view of Indians in New Zealand. Probably the lens through which Indian migrants are seen quite often has been in the context of Indian students who have come here and perhaps run into problems with questionable institutions in the past, or migrants who have come here and have again run into issues with employers. So that's probably not the most positive frame on things, but that's where we see a lot of the coverage. But I think there's an increased recognition of the value of the Indian community. In terms of New Zealand's view of India, I think, to go to your point, Anna, it's how much milk powder can we sell them, how much dairy, how much whatever. It's still very much through that frame, and I think it's sort of strange because there has been a recognition that we can't be that transactional, and you hear that from the Prime Minister and others, and yet somehow the preeminent goal for the relationship is to get a free trade agreement within 3 years. So it doesn't really seem to be building that sort of building up the relationships. So yeah, that's what stands out to me.
I can't answer any questions about... But you have another question? Okay, I'm going to pass.
We'll go to Chris Seed in the front row.
Thanks, panellists. That was very intriguing. Just in terms of sort of opening it up a little bit, we've talked a bit, or you traversed the challenges that we have as New Zealand, New Zealand interest, and the lack of New Zealand journalists. Can you talk a little bit about what the journalist footprint looks like from the rest, around the rest of Asia, from India, from Japan, from Malaysia, Singapore, in the region, and including in China? What's their footprint like? How's that being reported back into those countries, and to what extent, sort of related, do you sense from your media outlets that there's the interest in New Zealand in the region is evident because of, readership of the Washington Post, readership of following CNN, that there is actually a community in New Zealand that is actually interested in what's happening in the region?
New Zealand doesn't show up in the dot of readership on our map of where people are reading at the moment, so I don't think... I think there's room for growth in the New Zealand market for the Washington Post. $29 a year, very cheap. I highly recommend it. I think I would say that. The footprint of those other countries that you mentioned is enormous. Japan and Korea, obviously neighbours of China, they have many, many more outlets to start with, right? And Japanese newspapers with 10 million subscribers can afford to send correspondents into the region. So it's much more proximate, much more urgent, and more financially feasible for them. So, but they cover those countries, China in particular, in the same way that, they cover the big events, obviously, the big speeches and things, but they cover interests of, things that are of interest to Korean audiences or things that are of interest to Japanese audiences in that same way. I think the thing that struck me when I was there, that Singaporean journalists had really great access more and more inside China because of language, because of longer routes, and because many of the Singaporean journalists had been studying in China, so they had lots of inbuilt contacts that the rest, like I did not from not having studied in China. So I think the Asian countries have a much greater media footprint in these places. Do you want to talk about that at all, and what's happening in Korea in particular?
I was just going to mention, as an aside, I was reading the New York Times. I was also reading the Washington Post. But there was an interview with has anyone here watched Pachinko, which is an award-winning series on Apple TV? So they were interviewing the lead actor, huge South Korean star named Lee Min-ho, who is the star of Boys Over Flowers. And he mentioned in the interview that when he has downtime, he spends a couple weeks in New Zealand. So it did bring to mind that actually South Koreans are obsessed with New Zealand. And I'm not sure I'm even aware of this. I was thinking I would definitely recognize Lee Min-ho if he's wandering around New Zealand, but I don't know how many of you would. And I've mentioned to a couple people I was coming to New Zealand, and several of my South Korean friends said, I studied there for 6 months. So it's interesting. It's just something that caught my eye and my attention, is that South Korea does have a huge amount of interest in New Zealand, and there's a lot of travel here.
I think New Zealanders are very cool about celebrities. You can, even if we recognised him, we would just let him wander around unmolested in New Zealand. He's welcome back anytime, but Pachinko, great recommendation. Okay, let's go to James Kemba down the back there for another question.
But one thing I was going to say is that when it comes to covering North Korea, it is very complicated when you're an American correspondent. I think I was able to use the fact that I don't look like a typical American correspondent to my advantage, but I do think you being Kiwi was also a way for you to cover that country. So I do try to encourage people from countries that are not the United States and don't have that political baggage to think about the access or opportunity that their passport provides.
Good point. James.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, panellists. Talking about the footprint, you've painted a fairly sobering picture of why we don't have people in various places anymore. It's either politics or money, or both. And it's remarkable that this isn't only something that affects New Zealand. I mean, The Economist has just closed down its Chaguan column in the paper because it can't get a columnist anymore in China. I think back to when I lived in Hong Kong the first time, and the NZPA correspondent Bruce Conn lived next door to me. So we don't seem to have moved a lot further forward. My question to you all really is this a cycle? Do you see it eventually being able to get back into these places? And if you could, would you? Or is it a case of cutting things a different way?
Great question. I mean, we've gone backwards, actually, James, from that time when you lived next to the NZPA correspondent, in that the correspondents who were expelled from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post in 2020 was explicitly said to them they could not be based in Hong Kong. So whereas before Hong Kong used to be the watching post for looking into China, that is now, there's obviously been a lot of negative trends in Hong Kong, so that is now closed off to people. And so a lot of people are based in South Korea or in Taiwan, both of which have their own limitations or, implications. The question was,
I was just going to say, journalism is in the middle of an existential crisis, and
yeah, I think from a New Zealand perspective, I don't see it as being circular. I don't think we're going to come back around. I think this is only going one way. I mean, I have been a journalist for 15 years, and I don't think there's been a foreign correspondent in Asia in the time that I was a journalist, a New Zealand foreign correspondent. So I think the market realities, unfortunately, and finances are going to dictate, at least in terms of the New Zealand media, that we won't see foreign correspondents in Asia. I'd love to be proved wrong, but I'm afraid that's just how it's going, I think.
Yeah, if you look at, you could have one person paying their rent in an apartment in Hong Kong, or that same person writing a story, or they could be writing 15 stories about Kim Kardashian that day. So what are you going to do? Yes, down the back, please.
Yeah, hi, Fran O'Sullivan, a journalist from NZB. One of the questions I have, which has concerned me for some time, is the syndications we have in New Zealand. And I take your point, we are hugely dependent on international syndications these days. They're primarily American, or they're primarily out of the UK. I wonder, given the complexity of the region, and of course the people in this room today, why we aren't relying more on Nikkei, others, who have a different view of the world, and whether in fact we are getting, I guess, a truly perceptive view of what's happening.
Great question. I had tried and failed at Stuff to get us to take the Irish Times because I thought they were doing much better coverage than the Times. I think it's just entrenched. It's just, that's where the subscriptions are. Yeah, it's hard to change. I don't know, but it's a really good point, Fran, and maybe the first time we've agreed on anything. I don't know. On that note, thank you very much, everybody, for a very lively panel. We are down to the last minute. I think we'll break now. Thank you to the panellists for a lively discussion.